I've decided I'm not going to talk very long, but I do want to say just a couple things about Mr. Woodward. The lawyers in the room will know that when the Constitution was first ratified by the United States government, actually before it began to operate, the founders forgot a few things, and they fixed that with the Bill of Rights that was passed in 1791. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble peaceably and to petition the government, and it also forbids abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And over the last 50 years, it goes without saying, there has been no greater practitioner of the right of free speech and freedom of the press than Bob Woodward. And you have in your program the history of Watergate, and we know of his 20 books. And the most interesting thing, and I think the most important thing about what we see in what I call the Woodward archives, is the fact that he lets these witnesses to history speak to you. And he publishes them almost in real time. I mean, depending upon the publication date, it may be just a month's few old. So looking at his body of work and what the First Amendment encourages and what American democracy and the world need today, I think that Bob Woodward is the essence of being a good neighbor in a responsible republic, which is freedom of speech and freedom of press. And so, Bob, it's my great pleasure to present you with the Truman Good Neighbor Award.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to tell you what's on my mind, which is always dangerous. 50 years ago, August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. He gave his farewell address was bitter, full of self-pity about the way he and his family had been treated. Then there's a moment in this speech when Nixon turns to the camera and says the following, which I believe is one of the most extraordinary and important statements by any president. Nixon turned to the camera and said, "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." That the hating doesn't do in the other side, hating does you in. Hate is the piston. Unfortunately, it is the driver of our politics today in this country, with these divisions that have become so contentious, so hateful. If you think about it, hate has gone international in recent years. The Putin's invasion of Ukraine is all about hating the freedom and independence of Ukrainians. October 7th, last year, the Hamas attack into Israel, driven by hate. The brutality, the barbaric brutality of what Hamas did to Israel is staggering. Hate, it is like a snake through the world and our country. I remember being down interviewing President Trump when he was president. This is in 2020, the last year of his presidency. And he'd been impeached, and I'm interviewing him about that, and he's defending himself. And then he says, just look at this. And he brings in Dan Scavino, who is his media guru. And Scavino opens his laptop, and there is a picture of Bernie Sanders, the progressive senator. Trump, President of the United States, is right behind me here. He was so close, I worried he might bite my ear. Then there comes a video of Bernie Sanders, and Trump says, one of the most remarkable moments I've ever had as a reporter. He sees this, it's just a video of Sanders in Congress listening to something, but there's just music in the background. And Trump looks at it and he says, hate, hate. See the hate. I was baffled. Maybe Sanders hates Trump, but he certainly wasn't showing it at that time. Then Senator Elizabeth Warren comes on the screen. Trump, hate. See the hate. Then next is Kamala Harris. She's a senator from California at this time. This is before she became vice president. Trump, hate, hate, hate. See the hate. Now, Graham Greene, the great British novelist, said many times, don't despise your enemies. Do not despise the people on the other side, whoever they might be. They have a case. You have to listen to it. You have to understand it. You may reject it, but you need to listen. On the secret Nixon tape recordings, which finally came out in 1974, there's one tape that they're all remarkable, quite frankly, because these are secret things the president said he thought it would never come out. And so there is a kind of truthfulness of sentiment and conclusion. 1972, after Nixon had won 49 states, a landslide victory, and he's in the Oval Office with Henry Kissinger, and this is what Nixon said. Remember, we're going to be around and outlive our enemies. And also, never forget, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that on a blackboard 100 times and never forget it. Now, I know a number of TV talk show hosts who were very upset that they didn't make Nixon's list. Think about this, put some of the pieces together, and you want to ask, I think rightly, the question, how well do we understand our own government? George Washington, the first president, in his 1796 farewell address, 228 years ago, if I've got the math right, said, this is Washington, the great George Washington, leaving office. And he said, democracy is fragile. quote, cunning, ambitious, unprincipled men will usurp for themselves the reins and power of government. Fast forward those 2 centuries to Richard Nixon. And what did Nixon do? He usurped that power. George Washington also said that our Constitution is an experiment, doesn't contain guarantees. How did it work 50 years ago, the summer of 1974, when Nixon left office? On August 7th, Nixon called the Republican leaders to the Oval Office, the Republican leader John Rhodes, the Senate Republican leader Hugh Scott, and Barry Goldwater. And Nixon had no aide, no lawyer there in the Oval Office. And he knew his tapes were coming out, trickling out. He knew he was going to be impeached. And he wanted to know how he would do in a Senate trial, according to the Constitution. If impeached, which was certain at that point, there would be a trial. So he asked Rhodes and Senator Scott and Goldwater, so how do you think the voting will go? To remain in office according to the Constitution, he can be removed by 2/3 of the senators. He would need one more vote, 30-some, whatever it is, 36 votes or 34 votes to stay in office. And so Nixon, he's asking these leaders of the party he's nominally the leader of, so how am I going to do? So Rhodes and Scott say, Mr. President, we've asked Barry to be our spokesman. And so, again, one of the most remarkable moments in presidential history. Nixon says, Barry, so how does it look in the Senate? And Goldwater says, well, I've counted, Mr. President, gone around, counted, and Mr. President, you have 5 votes, and one of them is not mine. The next day, Nixon announced he was going to resign. Goldwater's, you have 5 votes, but one of them is not mine. So go back to just October of last year. It was the 50-year anniversary of the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired the special prosecutor Archibald Cox and started a avalanche of more investigations and trouble. Former Justice of the Supreme Court, Stephen Breyer, was at this dinner commemorating 50 years after Watergate. Breyer had served 28 years on the Supreme Court, and he got up and he had a little pamphlet, and he went like this, said, you know what this is? This is the U.S. Constitution. And in 1974, the system worked. The experiment worked. There was a nonpartisan pressure on Nixon to resign, and he did. And then Breyer asked the question, but will it always work? And he said, I think rightly, we do not know whether it will always work. And then he said, we have in this Constitution the criminal justice system. And think of what's going on right now. the criminal justice system, the Constitution, is holding the former President Trump accountable in New York. And there will be other cases that he has been charged with. But charged, that doesn't mean, as we know, really, truly, it means presumed innocent. And so there will be trials on the documents on election subversion, January 6th, insurrection, and it is working again so far. The former president, think of that. The current certain Republican nominee for the presidency again, coming this November, in a courtroom, held accountable, and he may be acquitted. That's the system. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a public trial, the right to a lawyer, right to an impartial jury, and a right to know your accusers and the evidence against you. And that's what we're seeing unfold. The New Yorker magazine a couple of months ago quoted a Harvard law professor saying that Trump, his actions and statements came close to breaking our democracy. I don't think that's true. I think it has tested our democracy in the extreme, but it is not broken. And implied in the oath of office that everyone takes is a kind of a unstated promise that the man or the woman is doing this public service for something more than their own personal well-being, but for the larger interest. And in the case of a president, the national interest. But not in the Constitution, but central to the Constitution is the character of the individual in any of these offices. We know what character is when we see it, and the country is an experiment. And in that experiment, the judgments about character are central. Katharine Graham, who was the owner, publisher of the Washington Post during Watergate, after Nixon resigned, sent Carl Bernstein and myself a personal note on, not stationery, but just on a yellow legal page. It said, "Dear Carl and Bob, you wrote some of the stories and now Nixon's gone. Quote, don't start thinking too highly of yourselves. Let me give you some advice." And she said, the advice is beware the demon pomposity. Pomposity, a sense of moral superiority, a sense of smugness, a sense of, oh yeah, I've got things right. Beware the demon pomposity. Write that on the blackboard 100 times and never forget it. Thank you very much.